So they can happily keep promoting that and covering up the truth and preventing research including the records of missionaries, of outsiders who came along to conquer traditional people. In many instances, the first reports describe healthy, happy people that have remarkable democratic structures. More and more, the propaganda is that this is human nature, as you say, it's always been this way. We are naturally aggressive, and yet there's so much evidence that that isn't true. So I think in terms of doing something for peace, it starts with a big picture analysis of, honestly, what's been going on. And it is about truth.
You're listening to
From Pain to Hope, the Peace Podcast
by NextGEN,
the youth branch of the Global Ecovillage Network. Hello, I'm Julio from NextGEN Europe, and in today's episode of From Pain to Hope, the Peace Podcast, I'm speaking with a truly remarkable guest, linguist, author and filmmaker Helena Norberg-Hodge. Helena is one of the pioneers of the global localisation movement and a co-founder of the Global Ecovillage Network. She produced and co-directed the award-winning documentary The Economics of Happiness and is the author of Local is Our Future and the classic and international bestseller Ancient Futures, Learning from Ladakh. Her groundbreaking work in Ladakh earned her the Right Livelihood Award, and in 2012 she received the GOI Peace Prize for her contribution to revitalizing cultural and biological diversity and strengthening local communities worldwide. I had the privilege of speaking with Helena just before the Planet Local Summit in Ladakh this year, a gathering that also marks her 50 years of work in the region. In our conversation, Helena takes us back to her arrival in Ladakh half a century ago, when the region was still largely untouched by the modern economy and people lived in self-reliant village communities. She shares how she witnessed a dramatic shift, long-standing harmony between Buddhist and Muslim communities giving way to rising tension as globalized economic forces, competition, and the money economy entered the region. From these experiences and from her work around the world, Helena challenges the widespread belief that human beings are inherently violent. Instead, she points to the global economic system as a key driver of conflict and explains how reports of peaceful indigenous cultures have often been distorted in ways that reinforce the idea that violence is simply human nature. Most importantly, she offers a way forward: localization, reconnecting with nature, with place, and with each other, moving beyond polarization, something, she reminds us, can only happen face to face, not through the one-sided bubbles of social media. So let's jump right into the conversation and welcome Helena Norberg-Hodge. Very, very warm welcome, dear Helena. So excited and so happy to be able to talk with you today about the topic of peace. What I found super interesting also watching your documentaries and reading your book Ancient Futures is that you described that you witnessed how a culture that has lived peacefully, also with different ethnic and religious groups in an area for a very long time, has then suddenly shifted and became more violent. And I would love if you could, explain the listener really what you witnessed. I mean, how did you experience this peace at the beginning? To what degree was there peaceful coexistence? And then how did it shift later?
Well, what I experienced was in the mid-1970s, this part of Tibet that belonged politically to India had been untouched by colonialism, and even by Christian missionaries that in many other parts of the world came in and destroyed cultural self-respect and brought about a lot of change. So here was in about the size of Austria, about 100,000 people that were still living off the land and dependent on one another. So even though Muslims had come in 500 years earlier, and there was now a considerable population of Muslims, Shia, Sunni, both, the majority were Buddhist. There was also a small Christian community, and they had all lived side by side for generations without conflict. But then I saw step by step how the modern economy, as it existed in the 70s, came in. And it's really important to try to understand this as a system, because in the modern era, one of the tools is through media. That didn't exist earlier when civilizations expanded and conquered each other. Even in the earlier colonial era, it wasn't so easy to go in and destroy cultural self-respect and cultural relationships as they had been. But what happened was the media brought in images of films, of advertising, and also tourism came in. And all of that made it seem as though in the Western industrialized world, where we had left the land, gone to the city, and were dependent on technology instead of each other, that there people had incredible wealth, they didn't need to work, and so there was enormous psychological misinformation. And at the same time, schooling came in as a promise that if you send your child to the school, they too will be able to live like Westerners. They too won't have to do any work, because in the West, you just sit in front of a screen and you push a few buttons or a typewriter, and then you have lots of money.
Yeah.
So this imagery played a big role in getting people to believe that having a school and going and studying well, you would also end up in the city as an engineer or doctor. So there was enormous both pressure away from the land. Farming was made to seem stupid and dirty. By the way, the cleanliness image is very much part of it, that you were dirty, and that cleanliness is a symbol of modernity. And so there was shame attached to being a farmer and on the land. And there was this sort of show-off culture that was romanticized. At the same time, the schooling, children were segregated into separate age groups. This is another knife that cuts through relationships. It's completely unnatural in all cultures around the world. Until modernity, you never separated children into groups of 30 or 40, 5 years old, 6 years old, or even 1 year old, 10 years old. That is a very, very constructive way of creating insecurity and conflict. What I experienced in Ladakh was that the 3-year-old would look up to the 4-year-old, to the 5-year-old, never thinking, oh, I'm not good enough. I can't walk as fast, I can't run as fast. There was this totally natural spread of ages from literally from 1 to 100. And that naturally creates an ongoing collaboration and teaching by the elders, the younger wanting to emulate. So learning and education was fundamentally different, and it was as much practical as theoretical. And I saw that in a few years, when these different communities, Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists, were suddenly pushed into the city looking for jobs, and there was a scarce supply of jobs, and there was the sense that, well, if the Buddhists are in charge, the Buddhists will get jobs. The Muslims are in charge, the Muslims will. Suddenly, conflict exploded in a very short period. So people who had lived peacefully side by side, and very much recognizing, I feel so privileged to have seen that, to speak the language fluently, and to have known that the Buddhists would come and celebrate Muslim holidays, the Muslims would come and celebrate, and everyone knew, you're Buddhist, I'm Muslim, but because they were not pitted against each other, in the city with the scarcity of jobs, you didn't have conflict. But here, conflict erupted after about 10 years of these pressures that pushed people away from the land and created insecurity, which then led to this group division. And I happened to have worked in Bhutan, a very similar culture in the Himalayas, where there were Hindus and Buddhists that had been living side by side for several generations. And in almost exactly the same period that this region was opened up to the modern economy, conflict arose and violent conflict, people killing each other. So when you look at what happened in Germany under the Nazis, when you look at what's happened in many parts of the world, particularly what's been very misleading is that the colonial powers that went out and, for instance, transformed the economy in India, again, creating this centralizing demographic pattern into the city to look for jobs that are doled out from the top. People are no longer dependent on each other and on their own land. So now there are these high-up forces pushing you in this direction. So what happened with modernity, too, is that it completely ignored regional differences and cultural, if you like, bioregional patterns of existence, where people had lived in a particular region where, say, there was a lot of water, or in a place like Ladakh, where it was mainly desert land. In those different bioregions, people were adapted to the land. Now, what was drawn up with these national boundaries, completely artificial, and people were pitted against each other for scarce jobs. So often what happened is when the colonial powers left, this unnatural delineation of people thrown together led to violent conflict. And so often in the West, the thinking is, oh, these primitive people, they've always fought, they don't know how to live together. But there are no honest studies that look at how they lived for generations without conflict before this artificial imposition. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I'm just thinking about several of the things that you were talking about. And one of the ones was that you were also talking about Europe.
Yeah.
And I find it super interesting that some philosophers, like, for example, Hannah Arendt, actually argue that it was even there the destruction of community ties that led to this atomization of the society, and which led to individuals that were very susceptible to identity coming from the outside.
Exactly.
So also to propaganda from the state.
Yeah.
And I find it really amazing to follow that logic. And I would just love to hear what do you think once we understand that? What should be the consequence? What can we do about it?
But first of all, also to elaborate on that way that people are made vulnerable and insecure and easily manipulated. See, again, remember that this process of driving people away from the security of land and the security of community, and the community again meant interdependence. I know that I depend on you, you know you depend on me. So it's not that I'm doing good deeds by helping you. I know that your help will come back to me. So you have the security of more stable relationships. Now suddenly you're thrown into this urban environment where there's no land, you're completely vulnerable. And in that situation, from above, the propaganda that creates an artificial identity, the national borders were completely artificial. They were not created by people who actually coexisted. They were created by powers from above who benefited from having destroyed your self-reliance, your self-respect, and your sense of security. And so when you're insecure, you are much more easily manipulated. And I think Hannah Arendt didn't look enough, as far as I know, at the fundamental difference between this traditional economy, which was land-based, versus the urban, financial, artificial construct I haven't studied her carefully enough. I should, because I feel I identify a lot with her. But I think, again, in my case, everything I have to say comes from Ladakh. It's not my thinking. It's what I saw. And I think that opportunity to see what it means to have those more secure relationships. I just also want to say that the people who benefited by destroying land-based self-reliant, and remember when I say land, I mean that people who lived in a particular region had access to the water, to the trees, to the land, to meet their needs. And when that's destroyed, the situation where you're also atomized, so you're no longer feeling an identity with people around you, it's so much easier to manipulate the identity into this artificial construct, of the nation state, which again was constructed by powers from above that benefited from it. They also often believed, they did believe, and they were gaining a lot of money and power by promoting a myth, which is that this modern urban development actually benefited us, that people got healthier, that before this modernity, everyone died like flies, they only lived to the age of 40, babies dying virtually before they were born. So they very much benefited by promoting this myth of progress. And most of them also really believe that before modernity, people were poorer, unhealthier, much less happy. So they can happily keep promoting that and covering up the truth and preventing research including the records of missionaries, of outsiders who came along to conquer traditional people. In many instances, the first reports describe healthy, happy people that have remarkable democratic structures. But then as they want to rob them of their land, in many cases, those people also probably become violent, but they're then described as these primitive and violent people. So we have to go underneath to find the information that gives evidence to the sort of thing that I'm saying. So what can we do about it in this situation? What is there to be done? Well, I would say, first of all, is uncovering a more honest description of what's been going on. A more honest description both of what's been going on historically and of what's happening today. Today, more than ever, we are locked into a system which is truly the opposite of human nature. It is a system that is so vast and it's so based on techno-economic systems that shield us from really seeing what's going on. And the speed of the technological systems. We're not talking about technology as a fork or a shovel or even a small-scale water system. We're talking about technologies that are global and that particularly have manipulated communication, so that the speed, particularly of the internet and computers, and now the mobile phone, now algorithms in social media, and AI speeding it all up. That speed and that global reach has been wonderful for very wealthy investors who can sit in New York or in Paris or London and invest in land, in minerals, in house building, agriculture, with no idea of what's happening on the ground.
Totally.
And all the time, the myth is that if the economy grows, it's good for everybody, when people are actually getting poorer. So I think in terms of doing something for peace, it starts with a big picture analysis of, honestly, what's been going on. And it is about truth as compared to quite partial, narrow framing that doesn't tell us what's going on. And the big, really big thing in all of that is that more and more the propaganda is that this is human nature, as you say, it's always been this way. We are naturally aggressive. And yet there's so much evidence that that isn't true.
Could you go a little bit more in detail into that evidence? Because that's super interesting for me. What evidence do you know of that is absolutely not true?
Well, I right now can't remember the authors, but even when I started my work in the mid-70s, the voice for peace and the study of peaceful cultures was far more prominent. And that meant accessible in both academia and media. So one example I can give you is Margaret Mead, who was a very respected anthropologist in America. Have you heard of her? So she, back in the 70s, was sort of a household name, certainly in the English-speaking world. And she was the head of the Museum of Natural History in New York at that point. Before that, in the 1940s, I think it was, one of the many books she had written was one called Coming of Age on Samoa. And she'd been in Samoa and she had written a book saying that maybe we could learn a lot in our own culture about how it is that the relationship between young men and their parents is so much more peaceful. And, this is a much more peaceful culture that we can learn from. When she died in 1986, almost like the day after, there was this big tome of a book from an anthropologist in Australia. And he was arguing that this was all made up, that she hadn't got to know the culture at all. And he even quotes a female Samoan anthropologist who says, oh, yes, we're just like everybody else. We're not more peaceful. But see, this is now 45 years later. And because she was so famous and respected, New York Times journalists and, from all the big media went to Samoa. But, I wasn't able to reach except, a few people not getting into the mainstream media with a message saying, look, what they are now going to see in 86 is virtually the opposite of what was there in the 40s. In the 40s, these young men and everybody else were fishing fish out of their own boats. They had their own ceremonies, their own culture, and were in charge of their lives. And again, they were interdependent. Now, they're pitted against each other, and the young men are sitting in front of television, eating fish out of tins given to them as welfare from the US. And they're just competing to get a visa to the US. It's a completely different reality. And in that competitive, unnatural situation, obviously, violence has grown. And in exactly the same period, here in Ladakh, between 75 and 86, I was seeing tensions beginning to build up as lives had been so transformed. But there are many other, there are books, as I say, written by the early conquerors about native tribes, describing them as peaceful and so on. And then a decade later, these same people are described as violent and tribal, primitive people. And the really scary thing is seeing how that evidence of earlier contact has got covered up as the violence and the war has grown. And another example is Schumacher, this German economist who had been trained in conventional economics, was the head of the coal board in England. And then he ends up in Burma in the mid-60s. And basically he discovers what I discovered in Ladakh in the mid-70s. And interestingly enough, both Buddhist cultures, which, by the way, I think Buddhism has contributed both to genuine peace of mind, but also to more peaceful coexistence. And so he then has to completely rethink his economic theories because there was no real poverty and people were quite healthy and happy, just like what I discovered in Ladakh. Now, his book, which he wrote from that experience, is called Small is Beautiful. And it was very much about the need for decentralization or localization. But today, people who are studying economics, even alternative economics, have never heard of him. So there's been a covering up of the evidence from the past, including thousands of books that give evidence, So what do we need to do to change things? It starts with being aware that we are so filled with assumptions that prevent us from even seeing a way forward. So one of the key ones of those is there are too many people now, we can't go back to the land. It's a fundamental one. And how are we going to feed the world? How are we going to feed 8 billion people? And the knowledge and the studies that have shown that if people are allowed to grow food based on local knowledge systems adapted to local climates, local soil, which, by the way, can be different within literally a few feet. You can have more clay here, more sand here, and you plant 2 plants and you can't, understand how they can be so different. Except when you're close, you know that you might have to add a little sand here or change to adding a bit of clay over there. So the killing off of local languages, local knowledge systems, local practices that evolved sometimes over thousands of years, sometimes tens of thousands of years, killing that off through this top-down monoculture that started in Europe and that drove people away, in driving them away from the land, also drove them away from knowledge. That is the main reason for war, it's the main reason for conflict, and it's the main reason for massive ecological destruction. So the way forward is very much to wake up to the big picture, which will mean uncovering books, films, knowledge that gives evidence to the truth that all of life is diverse and ever-changing. Every single moment, every single leaf, every single earthworm, every single cell in our body changing and unique, different. So in order to work peacefully and truly efficiently with life, the only real economy, we must adapt much more localized ways of doing. Respect the local knowledge, the experiential knowledge, not just theoretical, second-hand knowledge.
And in a nutshell, localization as an answer to the world we have right now where we see so many conflicts. And going back to the land.
Yeah.
What would you say are the consequences that come when you actually do it practically, when you go back to the land? And why do these consequences that will practically occur lead to more peace between the people?
Well, it's remarkable. I mean, I think I can only say that in a way it's in our DNA because we evolved for tens of thousands of years in close interdependence with one another. And remember again, it was intergenerational interdependence. It was naturally collaborative, benefiting the youngest and the oldest and everyone in between. We coexisted in that way, interdependent and as groups with the natural world. And so that's how we became human. That's how we evolved. And now, as we've been driven away, made insecure and fearful of one another, fearful of the past, believing we have to run into a new future with more technology, which actually is fundamentally about separating us from one another and from the land. It creates a speed at which we cannot know each other deeply enough. We cannot be known deeply enough to feel appreciated for who we are. So essentially, it's a path of fear instead of a path of care and love. And so we lose love, we lose our soul, we become fearful, and the whole system is based on more and more fear, from the individual to the war machine, to the heads of the nation states who believe we've got to be ahead or we're going to be left behind, and is absolutely afraid of being left behind. Yeah. So what we find is in our work in promoting what we call localisation, which is this coming back towards deeper community and connection with nature in dozens or thousands of different ways, recovering the deeper connections, people become happier. They become less fearful. And of course, out of the less fear and stress, people become healthier, physically and mentally. And as they become less fearful, they also recover more peace of mind, more security, more ability to not be so frightened of difference, not fearing somebody who's different. That's fundamental to the way of life that I experienced in Ladakh. And I've seen, what happens when we feel insecure, when we don't feel that we had enough love and recognition as children. We develop a need to prove ourselves, and that means stepping on others. It means trying to prove that we're better. And so it completely destroys peaceful, loving relationship where both parties can benefit.
Yeah, yes, it's super, super interesting. And I think also that fear leads to aggression is also so, I would say, common knowledge. And I've just, while you were talking, I was thinking about a quote that actually Goebbels said, so Hitler's propaganda minister, because he, and it's still really fascinating to think about it, he actually said that the population is usually peaceful, but you have to make them afraid. They have to feel fear in order for them to want to go to war, more or less. I don't have the exact words.
Yeah, no,
but yeah.
And you can see that. I even had friends in America who, before the Iraq War, intelligent, caring friends, who suddenly said, oh yeah, but what can we do? It was like, Saddam Hussein is going to invade America tomorrow. We have no choice but going into Iraq and finishing him off. Because the whole propaganda machine built that fear to support the war, so absolutely.
Yeah, and another thing that that you were talking about before, this digitalization that's even driving the globalization, I don't know if you want to call it wheel, even faster, swinging even faster.
Yeah.
I think also leads to increased polarization and people being more and more in echo chambers. And you have this situation where people often can't even talk to each other anymore because there's so much divisiveness. And I'm sure you also see a link between that and globalization.
Oh, completely. That has been pushed with the help of those same global corporations. Because as you know, it's been fundamental in spreading this consumer monoculture, which all the time extracts profit to the top. It's so sad that there has been almost no study of the global system as a system. Because what's happened is that among the elites, as leading economists and as politicians, as businessmen, they've been learning essentially propaganda about economic growth. They believe in economies of scale. It's complete rubbish. They believe that this explains why, food that's been transported for 10,000 miles can cost less than food that's been transported 1 mile. They believe that there are too many people that we can't feed them without technology. So we must have genetic engineering. We must have the chemicals. And I've seen in so many instances, when a pest comes to a particular crop or to some trees or something, the fear then pushes for spraying dangerous chemicals, which are responsible for Parkinson's and all kinds of neurological illnesses, and which are responsible for making those plants even more vulnerable. But the idea of allowing nature to start creating a balance is so remote now that it depends on us. It depends on people at the grassroots to keep on creating the alternatives, working with nature as people are doing in eco-villages. And for me, eco-villages are in a way at the forefront of this shift that we need, but they also demand so much of people that I'm focusing more now on the number one step is to try to build food security in the region where you live and try to encourage people to raise enough awareness so that there will be groups of consumers who will support farmers to grow healthy, diverse, genuinely ecological, organic food, and that they, for now, will be willing to pay a little bit more than they do in the supermarket, but all the time raising awareness that our taxes are subsidizing toxic, unhealthy food that's destroying the planet, destroying our health, and also threatening food security. So it's at the risk of many people going hungry. But I want to come back to what you said about the digital, because I hope people can remember the film, The Social Dilemma. These were pundits, high-level CEOs of companies in Silicon Valley who were in a film telling the world, if we continue to allow the social media to spread and influence our culture, we are doomed. It's destroying us. The algorithms inside these structures know that anger, polarization, hatred will lead to more clicks and extract more wealth to the top. So we're victims of this machine that is not only destroying children in, creating polarization, but is also creating addiction and extreme loneliness, fear, and increased suicide among young people. It's absolutely evil as a system. And yet the people who make money out of it, the people who still push it, I don't feel, I'm not God, I can't judge people as evil, but I certainly can talk about structures and mechanisms and ways of extracting wealth and controlling information to polarize people as evil, as a system. But in a way, we're all guilty, because all of us should step back and look at this and have a collective voice. Ultimately, we have the power. We really do. It's not even that ultimate. If the average citizen didn't just go along with this, it could never function. And we do have enough evidence now that we should all be coming together to say no. But part of what the system does is to all the time point at the individual. And so then the argument is, well, if you don't like the mobile phone or the impact of social media and that, well, then don't use it. You have a choice. You actually don't have a choice. For almost anyone now wanting to work to earn a living, or as an activist to change things, we're dependent on the internet. We're dependent on the mobile phone. But I want us to use those tools to paint a different picture, as we're trying to do now.
And I think also from my even life experience, it's so often that, I don't know, when I was at university, I was in the left-wing kind of bubble of people. And then I would just say for now, would consider certain people on the other side of the political spectrum. We would have certain judgments about them.
Yeah.
And then when I was in the United States, in Utah, and I was actually talking to a Trump supporter, I realized that so often when you have direct face-to-face conversations, there's so much you share.
Yes.
And it so much depends on the way people grew up or what information they were fed with. So it's, I don't know, I think if people actually met more from different positions face to face, we could already solve so many problems.
Exactly. And that's what I urge people to do, is to stay away from the social media. I've also been criticized for not taking a position on everything from Black Lives Matter to the vaccine to now Gaza. But I've realized that on that platform, you are condemned to be victim of this terrible polarization. So I urge everyone to get off that and to quite consciously meet face-to-face. I would like people to start by meeting face-to-face with like-minded people, because I want people to build up deeper bonds and to feel more secure in then expressing their views, but then also meet up with people of the opposite opinion along these divisive issues. And remember, a lot of it is essentially a politics of identity. It's not talking about structures. It's not talking about the kind of policies, or not even talking about our universal human need for love and connection, our universal human need for care, in caring for the elderly, caring for the young, caring for ourselves. So the universal human need for good relationships in family and with friendship is there. There is so much evidence. On people's deathbed, the biggest regret is not having spent enough time to be, in those caring relationships. Equally, we see across the world when people are privileged to spend time in nature, especially in wild nature, they can heal deep psychological problems, and not to mention even physical problems by being out in nature, using our bodies, walking. So that need for connection with others and the privilege of having time in nature is a universal need. And when we even look at studies like people suffering from depression, going to a supermarket or a mall will get more depressed. Going in a forest, or even more important, cultivating in a garden in community, find their depression lifting, and really quite rapidly. There's a lot of studies that show that, but you won't find them in the mainstream media, and you won't find them in academia. To look closer to the ground.
What I also found fascinating in some of the movies that you've made was that you were talking about the political left and right.
Yes.
And that these terms have become so meaningless, but also they've become such a tool for separation and a way to distract people from the actual systemic problems that exist. Could you talk a little bit more about that, and maybe how that could also be a way to create more unity between people again if we stop looking at these?
And it's interesting because in a way everybody can see that left and right has become meaningless. Again, if you look across the world now, most people have lost faith in their governments. And more they realize that the crises they're facing have been built up because both left and right have pursued policies where they were subsidizing and supporting global trade and global cooperation at the expense of a multitude of smaller and medium-sized businesses in their own region, in their own country. So that picture is gradually emerging, but it's one of the most important to go beyond left and right. Because what we see then is that without real economic power, we don't have political power. And it also then becomes obvious that even though we need to decentralize, if we think we can decentralize politically without any economic power, in other words, without any ability to have control over our own water, our own minerals, our own food, all the time, invaded by these corporate structures that completely destroy our own production for our own needs. So, the truth of the way that both left and right were born out of an industrial process, which is, again, urbanizing, pushing people into the city to be dependent on global traders. Both left and right have contributed to that process. And there's not been any discussion about that as the fundamental driver. The discussion has been, we're going to go with this industrial growth, and on the right, the idea is that the wealth will trickle down, it will distribute. On the left, they said, no, we need government to make sure that there is a distribution. So generally, the left was better intentions in a way, but it didn't question the urbanization, the destruction of self-respect and self-reliance, essentially this destruction of real wealth. They got caught up in an industrial growth as the only way to go. So now there's this fundamental difference that in a way the Greens, starting in Germany really with Patrick Kelly and so on, they had the idea that they were neither left nor right, they were ahead, but unfortunately they ended up co-opted by the idea that they were left, and they lost the vision of the need for genuine decentralization to allow people to come back to the local economy, the local resources, and the local interdependence instead of dependence on these top-down structures. So there is slowly a wake-up going on from the bottom up, but all the time, very clever ideas from think tanks funded by big business undermine it. So something like local food, more and more people have realized they prefer to have fresh local food, they prefer to support their own farmers, but all the time the ideas come to say, oh no, it's elitist, you obviously don't care about the poor, and all the time this myth that large-scale monocultural production is how we produce more food. The truth is that the small-scale diversified farms produce far more food per unit of land, per unit of water. So on a crowded planet, we basically have no choice but to support that. But that fact is very hard to get out there. And by the way, it's important to think about food production as absolutely primary, fundamental. Sorry?
For peace also.
Absolutely. For peaceful coexistence between people and the land. And it is not just some empty slogan to say, once we look at it clearly, that peaceful coexistence between people and nature go hand in hand with peaceful coexistence among people. But you do have to look deeply, you have to look back at history, you have to be aware of the ideas that suited the elite, that were pushed.
Yeah. Wow. And I've got many thoughts at the same time.
There's so many things. Me too. I'm saying so many things.
But also, I mean, just the fact, as you were sharing, that actually the food production that is not based on monocultures, that is like decentralized, small-scale, diversified food production, first of all, can produce more food per space, but also can, of course, feed many more people that actually work on the land, and that it doesn't only benefit a few. And I think that also probably food scarcity will be one of and unfair distribution of resources will be one of the main drivers of conflict in the future, especially with escalating climate change and droughts and so forth. So I totally agree that going back to local food systems is so important for peace.
No, I think that for me, all these 50 years now, as I've been bringing the lessons from Ladakh and very much aware of happiness as something that was central. I was in Ladakh, I encountered the happiest people I'd ever met. And then I go back to Sweden, which at that time, in the mid-70s, was considered a model of a balanced and quite harmonious modern culture. And I realized we just had, escalating depression, alcoholism, suicide. Why? Because people were driven from the land and from each other, living alone. And as we break down the broader intergenerational relationship and go into nuclear families in the city, it's not working. It's not working, and it's clearer and clearer now. But I think the way back is not as long, is not as difficult as people believe, particularly if they understand that we can create more wealth. And it's fundamental to look at it in terms of food production. But remember that on that diversified farm, you're talking about having animals as well. So you're talking about leather, you're talking about wood, both as a building material and as a fuel. You're talking about building materials. So you're talking about overall productivity to benefit our basic needs, food, clothing, shelter. And so there is a way back that can be achieved very rapidly if we can liberate ourselves from this prison of ideas and also now rules and regulations, subsidies. So changing that system is not so easy. But practically, if we could change, particularly what governments use to shape the economy, to shape the future, both left and right are using taxes, subsidies, and regulations and laws to support global corporations and banks, to make them wealthier and wealthier, while even governments getting poorer compared to the global banks and businesses. And they're becoming enslaved to them. So we, the people, the vast majority, more than 99%, we can wake up and insist that our taxes are no longer going to be used in that way. We can have a peaceful revolution of non-compliance and demanding that we can take the power back, not ruled by global corporations, but bring very importantly, we can bring the power from the global McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and Monsanto to the nation state level. But simultaneously, even before that, we can demand decentralizing power from the nation state. That wouldn't weaken the nation state, because as we bring the power down, as we start implementing localized economic development, we actually become wealthier, we become more stable, more secure, more powerful and wealthier, which enables us then even more to demand that the national government comes back around tables with other nation states to take the power back from the global corporation. It's very simple. Global corporations will no longer be allowed to be global. They need to decide, okay, General Motors, are you American or not? Because you're not going to be able to be global. They can just go in and out without any rules. You can't go in and out and then sue our governments if they try to restrict your profit. I know it sounds like a very big ask, and it can feel like it's not doable. But remember, those corporations, they don't have the army. They don't have real power. Their power is money that we have allowed them to create out of thin air. So the whole spectrum from Ladakh to the global economy has showed me without any doubt that when you realize that the real economy is the resources, every weapon you need, every bomb, every computer, every chair, every bit of food comes from nature. And once we know that that's the wealth, and we know how we have to organize to make ourselves wealthier without destroying the land, that is where the real power is in the real world. But in the name of we've allowed this escalation where wealth has been removed from real wealth into a make-believe, complete make-believe fiction. Those banks can add zeros to their money without doing anything, nothing productive. And with those dollars or euros, they're influencing life on Earth, and those euros are being used for weapons. So there is a link between the military, fear-based economy and this corporate economy. But without the compliance of the citizens, it could never work. So it's up to us to wake up. And I've just seen amazing changes in about 3 or 4 years. Healing of land, incredible barren land, be so rich and productive. I've seen people who are deeply depressed or even suicidal, healing. Once that fundamental connection, meaningful connection between people and land is restored. So I am quite convinced that in the long run, we will come back to that. And I'm very motivated to try to contribute to change in thinking before that. Just the change in thinking is the important one now, to start a process in the right direction. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And I can also imagine once humans become more whole again and feel purposeful, feel connected, that then it's much harder to then persuade them to go to war, for example.
Absolutely.
And at the same time, also when we have all the negative consequences of globalization and of the money trickling to just the 1%, that then you also have to create enemies and you have to create political tensions in order for the population not to turn against the ones in power. So it's a recipe also for orchestrated conflict from above, I would say.
Yeah, no, it's so terrible to think that conflict is being orchestrated. And when I try to understand the mindset of people, I do more and more, I see that among the very wealthy and privileged class, they are being able to essentially present themselves and others with lies about how things work. But because we're not coming together enough, and particularly not focusing enough on the big picture to spell out what's actually going on, we have to be very careful that we don't end up too narrowly focused. And this is the tragedy, is that around the world offer the activism to resist this very destructive system. It's often very narrowly focused, on this particular dam, on this particular clear cut of the forest that I know and love, of the damage that's being inflicted locally, but stepping back to see that as a system. So I have so much in common with someone else who is more worried about the fish, or is more worried about cancer or poverty or loss of democracy. So that's the key, is that we get a truly more systemic view so that we can then share the same voice. We don't have to become one organization. We don't have to abandon our focus on poverty or climate or whatever it might be, but we'll be linking it to that systemic techno-economic global juggernaut, and we'll be very clear that left and right categories are not helping at all.
One last topic that I'm super curious about. What we also see right now is everywhere almost simultaneously is getting rid or making less powerful democratic rights. And I'm not using the best words, but you know what I mean. We see across countries that democratic rights that were once taken for granted, even in the previously so-called democratic countries, are being eroded. And at the same time, we also see increased strong leaders, so-called strong leaders, populism, presenting simple answers. On the other hand, also populists like Trump, even using language that in some cases even resembles a critique of the globalized system, but then doesn't act upon it. I don't know, that were probably three things. But the current trend we are witnessing right now with the erosion of democratic rights, the rise of populism, where do you see the connection to globalization and the economic system going?
Completely. And I hope you'll read my book, Localist, Our Future, where I do write about that. And so for me, it's very, very clear that when people are not allowed to see what's actually going on, they're reacting against government. So what's happening is poverty is increasing dramatically. And it's everywhere. But where this trend is most notable right now, well, actually, I was going to say it's more in the industrialized world, but it's not. It's across the world that people are seeing governments squeezing them. They're seeing poverty increasing, and they become more and more angry at government. So that leads to a type of laissez-faire, small government. We don't want this government that gets in the way. What they're experiencing also is that their poverty is increased by regulations that make it extremely difficult for them to operate. So this is another very important fact, is that in the last 40 years or so of globalization, governments have implemented more and more heavy bureaucratic regulations for the smaller businesses, even the national, and they've been removing all the rules for global. The global corporations are suing governments if they do anything to inhibit their profit making. And they are lobbying governments to bring in regulations that constrict and restrict the local and national businesses. At the same time, those local and national are squeezed with more and more taxes, while those taxes are subsidizing the global. So they go into building a global infrastructure right now, massively for AI, using water, minerals on larger and larger scale to build up the AI technosphere that's going to be central to extracting wealth. It's not going to work in the long run. It's going to be so clearly destructive. But how many more years are we going to move in this direction without people stepping back to look at why this rise of populism, the vote for these right-wing leaders who say, away from government, we're going to grow the economy for you. So then they open the doors to this empire of corporations to rape and pillage even more the local and national economy. But people don't know that because they're not even talking about the real rule being this corporate financial casino empire.
And why do you think they are so attractive to people, the populists around the world right now?
No, but see, I'm saying they're populist because they're popular because they are saying that we're going to do away with all these government rules and all this interference. And all of that interference has been targeting them downwards. So since the Second World War, the whole agenda has been freedom for the global, no rules. That's what free trade is about. And then with more and more and more rules for the small. And a lot of those rules are hideously destructive of the local. So even in farming, having to have these vaccines or these inspections, which cost a lot of money to the small, destroy them. In the meanwhile, the big boys, to the extent that they do any compliance, it's nothing in the cost of their mega businesses. So we're having a path that very clearly makes people angry at government. Wanting smaller government is always the swing to the right. The left has always wanted bigger government because, as I said before, they weren't questioning the scale of industrial production. They weren't questioning what that meant for resources or for community relationships. They were only wanting to bring in rules so that the wealth would be distributed. And because they weren't critiquing the global, they weren't helpful at all, particularly in these last 40 years.
So if I understand you correctly, that actually the right-wing populists, they are taking some absolutely legitimate frustration of people that their small-scale businesses have been more and more regulated, and that a few big companies and taxed, and that a few big companies, that all the profit went to them. And
But generally, most of the small didn't know that governments were simultaneously helping the big, because the creation of this linked up empire of global banks and corporations and more trade that create wealth for them wasn't discussed. So they only feel angry at government, want smaller government. And so when the Trumps and the Malays and so on reduce government, they actually open up the local economy for even more exploitation. And this is again why, in the long run, all these myths are not going to work. There will be more clarity. But how long we have to wait. And I've been shocked also at the polarization, around the vaccine of people, families and friends. And so the path to peace is going to start with a bigger picture understanding that says, why are crises increasing? Every day we look, there's this sense of breakdown. And so what we're inviting people to investigate is this breakdown because of some natural human desire to always grow? This is one thing we're told. It's just natural to want to grow and grow. No human being wants to grow beyond 6 feet to 7 feet to 8 feet. Nobody. It's completely unnatural. Yes. So it's not to do with human nature. It's to do with the system that started becoming inhuman a long time ago because it was so disconnected from real people and real life. So much of it is really scale, speed, and the separation between what we see, what we believe, and what's actually happening. There's this system that intervenes and creates abstract concepts, including numbers, about what's going on, that is completely misleading. And so ultimately, localization is necessary for us to become more aware of the realities, of the diversity, the complexity, the contradictions also in the living world. Once we're closer to that, we're much more tolerant. But remember, being closer to life, meaning human life, and also makes us more secure. So we're far more able to deal with diversity, with difference. And it goes down to the finest detail of, in more traditional cultures, if someone has for some reason had a leg cut off or something, people are not at all afraid of saying, laughing at them and saying, well, you can't run the way we do because, you don't have one of your legs, but totally including that person as part of the community. And we don't understand what's happened to us as we're so separate and isolated. We don't dare to say, I don't dare to say to someone, you've got black skin and I've got white skin. Can't say that because we've been locked into this artificial, constructed idea of what peace looks like. Peace fundamentally is about accepting difference, diversity, and living with that. And that comes about when we are loved enough as children and feel connected enough not to be so insecure that we can't face something that's different. And it's as we become closer, both with others and with the living environment, that we become more intelligent, we become more tolerant, we become much more aware of the differences and complexities that don't threaten us. Yeah.
Okay, this really touched me. That I felt it very strong. When I'm more in my humanhood, then it makes so much sense that it's much more easy for me to accept and tolerate differences.
Yeah.
That this is at the cause of conflicts, that we cannot tolerate these differences anymore. It makes so much sense. And it also makes so much sense that localization can unify a people again.
Yeah.
And I just want to ask you, Helena, if there's anything after all these topics that we've covered that you would like to add or that you would like to say as a last word.
Well, I guess that I'd like to say that it's very difficult that I'm dealing with such a big picture that many people have not been used to hearing. And I just urge people to come to our website, localfuture.org, and to look at some of our films and materials, because even though what we're saying is rare, not that many people are saying it, it resonates with people's deep knowledge, their common sense, their experiential knowledge, what they've experienced. So very often people feel very empowered by seeing that, I was feeling alone in not fitting in and not going along. And so it can be very empowering to actually get information that resonates with what we have a deep knowing about, deep in, subconscious often. So, I urge people also to pursue looking at this bigger picture, which goes all the way from, our inner need for deeper connection, which meditation and many spiritual practices can help. But spirituality, the way it's been brought into the modern Western world, has not actually been helpful because it's not been pursued in a holistic enough way, in a way that really recognizes that fundamentally peace of mind is connected to our relational being, to our relationship with others and nature. So it's ended up being a little bit, I sit in my room alone and meditate and everything will be fine and I'll have inner peace and then we'll have peace in the world. So that narrow focus on spirituality has been counterproductive, I think. Whereas what we're, again, totally based on experiences and seeing how it worked here, we're looking at it in a more holistic way, in a more grounded way. And it does bring results. So I like to invite people, with the idea that there is essentially a rethinking of assumptions, a rethinking of beliefs that will resonate with what I feel more deeply. But in order to arrive there, I need to take the time, I need to take a deep breath, and it will mean looking at this big global economic system, which can feel overwhelming. And so we urge people to try to identify a few people near where they live. It could be from their office, from their university, it could be friends, it could be relatives, it could be just 2 or 3 people, maybe up to 20. And then as a group, explore the paths that we're talking about that include deeper connection to one another, deeper support, more honesty about our deeper feelings, our deeper fears, our problems at home, that can help us to feel more connected. This is a key to feeling better about ourselves. And we're saying that what we're offering is materials that help us both to improve our well-being and arrive at actions we can take as a community that will help to deal with world problems from a systemic point of view. So it's not just treating isolated symptoms, but not contributing to systemic change. And the systemic change that we're talking about is both what we can do at the community level and how we then collectively can demand policy change. So these are two quite different, but both needed. The steps we can take as a community, so first of all, in the individual healing, then the community work. Those community efforts, particularly in rebuilding the local food economy, but also supporting a genuine local economic prosperity. These are the foundations of the world we need. This is how we proved over tens of thousands of years that we can live more peacefully with the land and with one another. And it has to do with those more localized structures. So we need to build those whatever. But as we start building them, we also provide evidence for the benefits to then demand policy change. And ideally, we would, as a group, change the I to a we, and then as a local group, link up with other local groups, do things like some people in the localization movement have done. They've managed to get all the members of the local council where they live to abandon party politics, to move away from being Labour or Conservative or even Green, to be locals for Freiburg or locals for Ladakh. And as they come together, previously having been left and right, ideologically focused, and they now are looking at the local community, the local water, the local resource, they actually find they have a lot in common. So there are many aspects to this localization that are extremely helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda, for this lovely conversation.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm so glad you're interested. And I hope we can get it out. I'm willing to talk forever, to get things out. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to From Pain to Hope, the Peace Podcast
by NextGEN,
the youth branch of the Global Ecovillage Network. If you enjoyed this episode and want to find out more about Helena's work, visit localfutures.org. You can also watch her documentaries for free on YouTube. Last but not least, if you want to support our work and this podcast, please do share, follow our channel and give a like to this video. You can also support our work financially with a donation to NextGEN.